Wow. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you, Jane.
You're
We're
welcome.
always pleased to be able to actually be introduced by none other than Jane Tillman. So let me get the screen up here. Okay, everybody see that all right?
Looks good.
Okay,
Awesome.
all right. Well, today we're going to talk to you, as Jane mentioned, about our fourth book, which was entitled Native Host Plants for Texas Moths. We actually got this idea because, like many of you, we're interested in many aspects of nature. And when we were looking at field guides for plants, sometimes they would mention that they were host plants for a particular species. And then when we would look up those species of moths and butterflies, sometimes they would refer to general plants like grasses or clovers or things of that nature that were host plants. So we thought, why not try to put this into one book? And so that's how the idea was born. The first being the book Between the Host Plants for Texas Butterflies, going beyond just monarchs and milkweeds. And then we expanded it to Native Host Plants for Texas Moths. We should tell you, though, that this is just a highlight of the moths that you can see in Texas, as there are so many more than there are butterflies, and we'll get into that in a minute. So what we're going to go over today, very briefly, just quickly start with the big picture on the habitat and plant diversity of Texas. I think we all know that natives are important, but why not non-natives? Why do we not want them in our landscapes and in our habitats? What's a host plant versus a nectar plant? And then we'll talk about the insects themselves. We call it the Lepidoptera lifestyle, or Lepidoptera is the order of insects that includes both butterflies and moths. So we'll talk about some of the general differences between the two, the life cycle that they go through, the difference between a chrysalis and a cocoon, how moths actually find mates and find their host plants. And then Jim will take you through what's called the host plant species accounts. And this is directly from the book in terms of those plants that are host plants for associated moths here in Texas. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit about gardening for Lepidoptera, planting, maintenance, other ways you can attract moths to your garden, and what we do to photograph moths. And sometimes people are interested. So big picture, there's many different maps of the ecoregions of Texas, but as we all know, Texas is a large state, second only in land area to Alaska. There are at least 10 areas with a wide variation in climate and landscapes, which is what leads to our habitat diversity. And there's also a large topographic diversity. If you haven't been to the coast, well, you know, it's at sea level, of course. And then in West Texas, there's 91 mountain peaks a mile or more high. So that leads to a lot of different types of habitat. Texas is also in what's called the transition zone. So it's where eastern species have their most western part of their range, and western species have the most eastern part of their range. And same thing between southern and northern species. So it's where all those regions meet, and that adds to our diversity. And of course, plants, which are the basis for many things, depend on rainfall, and that can range anywhere between, on average, 8 to 56 inches in the state of Texas. So because of all that, we have a wide diversity of plants in Texas. And in fact, it's one of the highest number of plant taxa, which includes species, subspecies, and variations, at about 6,000. And it's divided into more than 220 families. Many people know that there's about 500 species of butterflies seen in Texas, but when it comes to moth species, there's about 4,700. And in fact, many moth species and their host plants associations are still being discovered. Moths can use many different types of plants, just like butterflies, as host plants, and that includes trees, shrubs, wildflowers, vines, and grasses. And although we didn't cover it in our book, but some moth species actually feed on lichen and algae, which is really quite interesting. Plants are the principal factor for dictating moss distribution. And we actually had an interesting question we hadn't had before last time we gave this presentation, which is why are there so many more species of moths than butterflies? And we have two kind of theories about that. One is you're going to see that moths actually use many different types of plants as their host plants, and so they're more diverse that way than butterflies. And we also think that the fact that they're mostly, but not all, nocturnal, that has something to do with a lack of predation other than bats and other night flying birds. So they're probably better protected that way. All right, still on plants, why natives? I think we all know that they create and help serve a healthy ecosystem. They can help us reclaim land, preserve and produce soil, protect our waterways, and keeping those nutrient cycles intact. If these insects have evolved by feeding on native plants and we get rid of those native plants and replace them with non-natives, we've broken that nutrient cycle. And then there won't be the caterpillars and the moths and the butterflies needed to feed other animals like birds. Natives are already adapted to our soils and climate, so they are naturally hardy and generally disease-free. And of course, they are what creates the habitat for all of our local wildlife. They provide shelter, food, and places to raise young. And even if all that doesn't mean a whole lot to you, they are beautiful reminders of our natural heritage and where we live. So non-natives, why do we not want that in our environment? Well, a non-native is defined as a plant or animal living or growing in a place that is not the region where it naturally lives and grows. Non-native species frequently outcompete native ones. They're frequently invasive. They can produce copious amounts of seed that are easily transported. They can thrive on poorer soils, and many of them have aggressive root systems. They can also bud out and leaf out earlier in the season, or produce growth inhibiting chemicals and not allow other plants to grow in the area. And as I said, they can disrupt the natural nutrient cycles if they take over a habitat. There are some statistics reported from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency that non-native lawns and gardens are actually sprayed with more than 90 million pounds of insecticides and herbicides annually, which doesn't help our environment. Gas-powered mowers, edgers, and blowers will emit 27 million tons of air pollutants every year, not to mention noise pollution. And watering our landscapes, especially the non-natives, will squander up to 9 billion gallons of water a day, and that water is potable water that we could all drink. So these non-natives actually decrease biodiversity. And in fact, 42% of endangered and threatened species today are detrimentally affected by non-natives. And of those 42%, 18% have actually become endangered or threatened as a direct result of non-natives. And there's a list here of the top non-natives to avoid or replace. If you look over on the left side of the slide, the stages of biological invasion, it's great if you can prevent non-natives from coming into your environment. But if they do arrive, you could at least try to eradicate them before they get established. If not, maybe contain them so that they don't reproduce and spread. But if they do displace the natives, they will end up dominating the ecosystem. Much like the cartoon below there, where the two ladies are saying, sure, it's a bit of an invasive plant, but I haven't gotten any complaints from our neighbors. And you can see their neighbor's feet. And that's about all that's left of him after the vine gets him. All right, so let's talk about the terms host plants and nectar plants. Many times when people put together these gardens for Lepidoptera, whether it be for butterflies or moths, they think of the nectar plants that the adults use. But the host plants are the ones the female butterflies and moths deposit their eggs on. And those are the ones that provide the food for their caterpillars. And in fact, many butterfly and moth species require specific host plant species for their caterpillars to eat. But nectar plants, on the other hand, are the food sources for the adults. They prefer flowers that provide an ample nectar or have a large landing platform that they can actually utilize. And nectar source selection is much less specific, and it's typically not the host plant in many cases. So what are some of the general differences between butterflies and moths? Well, none of these are hard and true for every single species, but generally speaking, butterflies have antennae, usually with a small club at the end, whereas moths' antennae can be feathery or sawtooth or even thread-like without that club at the end. Butterflies often tend to hold their wings folded vertically over their abdomen or out flat, whereas moths, the wings tend to be folded in a tent-like fashion, hiding their abdomen, but they can also be open or flat. Butterflies are typically diurnal or are active during the day, but some are crepuscular, which means they are active at dawn or dusk, whereas moths are typically nocturnal, but some of them are day flyers. And we'll show you some examples of those. The other biggest difference is in the life cycle, where butterflies form a chrysalis in the pupal stage and moths form a cocoon in the pupal stage. And we'll get to that in a second. And as I mentioned before, roughly speaking, moth species outnumber butterfly species by about 15-1. So the life cycle of a moth is very similar to that of a butterfly. Eggs can be laid singly or even in multiples, depending on the species. The larva or caterpillar will hatch and begin to feed, usually first on the egg shell casing. That's their first meal. Then they often feed on different parts of plants using various techniques. Some will feed on the buds, flower buds, some will feed on the leaves, some will like new leaves versus old leaves, so it kind of depends on the species. And as the larvae grow, it goes through several phases or instars, which are defined as the phases between two periods of molting. The final instar, which is usually about the fifth one, pupates, which is an immature form between the larva, the caterpillar, and the adult. And it's often in a silken casing called a cocoon for the moth and a chrysalis for the butterfly. But sometimes for moths, they will actually pupate underground, and we'll show you an example of that. Adults then emerge or eclose, and some species actually don't feed as an adult, so they don't nectar at all. So we talked a little bit about chrysalises and cocoons. The chrysalis is the pupal stage of most butterflies, although again, there's always exceptions. Some will actually pupate in plant roots or stems or even pods. And it's from the Latin meaning gold, which refers to the metallic-like coloration that actually appears on most chrysalises. It is a hardened case, typically formed in the open, often on the host plant or nearby, and it's usually attached to a surface by a combination of a silken pad that the caterpillar spins, and then it hooks into it with hooks at the tip of its abdomen. Moths, on the other hand, generally pupate in a cocoon, although, as I said, we will show you an example of some that pupate in an underground dirt chamber. The word cocoon comes from medieval French, meaning eggshell, and it's usually a soft but tough silk case, and it's typically camouflaged with bits of vegetation, usually from the host plant. It's often attached to twigs or other pieces of vegetation, and usually it's in a little more concealed location, so you have to look a bit harder for it. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how moths find a mate and how moths find a host plant. First, I want to back up and tell you that insects that eat plants are called phytophagous, and those that eat more than one species of plant are called polyphagous. Those that eat only one species or type of plant are called monophagous. A great example of a monophagous butterfly would be the monarch butterfly eating only milkweeds. An example of the polyphagous butterfly, as an example, would be a gray hair streak, which eats many different types of plants. So first thing that has to happen before they can lay eggs is they have to find a mate. So what happens with moths is that females release pheromones through the air from a gland on the tip of their abdomens. Of course, each of these scents is species specific, and it's sensed by the males many times from miles away using receptors called sensilla on their antenna. So if you look at the picture on the upper left, the very uppermost picture shows the female's antenna, which are more thread-like or saw-like. This is a Cecropia moth, by the way. And the lower inset picture, you can see the more fan-like or coral-like antenna of the male. And the reason they are like that is because that increases their surface area, and therefore they have a better chance of actually having more of these receptors on their antenna and being able to sense that pheromone from the females. In fact, this picture of the Cecropia moth's mating was taken in our backyard right after the female emerged from the cocoon. So he didn't waste any time. All right, once they found each other and the female has fertilized eggs, how does she find a host plant? Well, one of the things we know is that they utilize smell and taste, and they differentiate plants that way, that moths have receptors both on their legs and their antenna. And that's how they actually fly around and sense and land on plants and see if that's really their host plant or not. What we don't know is if they use any visual cues to locate plants. Do they look for plants that are growing in abundance to increase the chances of survival of the larva? And do they learn where the location of host plants are? Some of these things are still being discovered. All right, so we've talked a little bit about the big picture of plants, a little bit about moths and how they compare to butterflies, how they find each other and their host plants. So Jim is going to take you through some of these pairings that we've highlighted in the book.
Yeah, so we'll go through some specific examples of plant and moth associations from the book. And if you've seen the butterfly host plant book or the moth host plant book, they're both laid out kind of in this format with a main plant photo on the left and a couple detail shots and a range map in smaller photos below it. And then on the facing page, there'll be, in the books, actually just information on the plant, but in this presentation, we'll include some fun facts on the moths as well. And then have a picture of the adult moth and a caterpillar photo, and list any additional moths that we may not have illustrated to go with that. And a lot of times you'll find that the caterpillar is maybe more interesting than the adult in these guys. Some of them are pretty spectacular. So the first plant we'll talk about today is giant rain lily. It blooms after a rain, and there's actually two species of these rain lilies that are very similar, and one blooms in the spring, one blooms in the fall. And there are a couple little species of moths that utilize this plant, Cerathosia and straight line Sidosia. The straight line Sidosia has a little sexual dimorphism in the male and female. The female pictured here has white within spots within the black markings on the wings, and the male lacks that white, so they're just kind of orange and black. And the caterpillar in this case is eating the seed head and not necessarily the leaves on these guys. And that's true for a lot of butterflies and moths, that they may very well eat buds or seed heads, and not necessarily, or roots even, but not necessarily just leaves. So the next one is pretty much something that everybody is familiar with in Texas. It's found throughout the state. Firewheel or Indian paintbrush. It's or a blanket. Sorry, Indian blanket. But anyway, it's an aster, daisy-like flower, colorful, grows in great big colonies, and is a very popular plant in the springtime. It's utilized by one of the Shinia moths. The Shinias are flower moths, and they're small, some of them colorful little moths that are very tightly associated with their host plant. These little guys in general will live their whole life on one species of plant. They'll nectar on it, they'll lay their eggs on it, the caterpillars will eat it, and they won't get very far from their host plant. So in this case, the painted Shinia utilizes firewheel, and it's great looking little moth. They aren't very large, but they're very colorful. And seeing one or two of them on one of these blooms when they match the flower color so well makes for a nice picture. Caterpillars can be kind of candy cane little guys, and they will tend to eat the seed heads on these as the flower matures. Now, this is one we ran across in doing the research for the book that we just had to include because it just seems so unusual. Yellow pitcher plant is an interesting plant from East Texas piney woods. See them in the big thicket and other places. It's an insect carnivore, you know, so how could that possibly get used as a host plant for an insect? But these little pitcher plant mining moths have adapted very well to living with these things. So they have the caterpillars, or well, the moth has feet that were adapted to hang on to the sides of the pitcher wall so they don't fall in, and it'll only leave the pitcher at night. So this bottom picture, this bottom small picture, these 5 little black dots looking down the throat of the pitcher plant are actually the faces of little pitcher plant moths waiting to come out. They're hanging out just above the level of the liquid. And they'll lay eggs in there, and the caterpillars will are kind of miners in the walls, and then when they're ready to pupate, they'll chew a hole in this thing in the bottom to drain out the fluids and then pupate just above it. So it's kind of a very specialized moth. Jimson weed, or sacred datura, is a pretty common plant around the area. Very showy, big white flowers, tubular, long-throated flowers. Night blooming, which is kind of a fun, different kind of plant to have in your yard. So it's ends up has been used in the past in Native American ceremonies as a source of hallucinogens. So it's kind of an interesting little guy. Don't chew on it too much, but it's got a strong association with these large sphinx moths, the Carolina sphinx and the pink spotted hawk moth, which are both pretty good sized moths with big caterpillars. But the moth adult has a very long proboscis and can go down and sip nectar out of the flowers of these things, and in the process get some pollen on its head, go to the next flower and pollinate it. And it takes a very long proboscis to be able to do that with these big flowers. So they're the primary pollinator for them and help them reproduce as a plant. And then to return the favor, the moths get to eat the leaves at the caterpillar stage. Now, for the Carolina sphinx, the caterpillar is also known as the dreaded tomato hornworm. So if you happen to have them in your garden and they're eating your tomato plants, it might be nice to have some Jimson weed in there along with it. And then you could relocate the caterpillars to that. Post oak is one of the nice common oaks that grow in Central Texas and East Texas, North Texas. It's had been utilized for furniture and flooring as white oak. It's resistant to decay and has been able to survive some fire by having a little bit thicker bark. A couple of moths use this. The Polyphemus silk moth is kind of a common silk moth for our area. It's mainly brown, has these big eye spots on the hind wings. There's a kind of a more localized, less common version out in the Trans-Pecos that's sometimes called the Western Polyphemus or the Aculea silk moth. It's similar looking, but has a little more black scaling on the wings, and the eye spot center color is more orangey than yellowish, but they're very similar. And also the squat underwing utilizes this, and it is very good at camouflage. These, with their wings folded over them, they're very hard to spot perched on the bark. It'd be very easy to miss one, but they have very colorful hind wings. And the pupa will wrap themselves up in silk and dried oak leaves. And another favorite, who doesn't love Luna moths? And one of their favorite host plants is sweet gum. It's sweet gum tree is sometimes called the sandbur of the forest for this nice, hard, prickly fruit. Looks a little bit like a sycamore seed, but very spiky. You wouldn't want to step on one with bare feet. The infertile seeds of this tree have high concentrations of shikimic acid, which is used to make Tamiflu. Luna moth uses this, as I mentioned before. It has beautiful lime green, kind of pale green wings, a purple leading edge to the wings, and pale cream colored or white bodies. And they're very beautiful. Big green caterpillars, kind of hard to miss, and you aren't going to mistake these for anything else in North America. The wings, probably about 4 inches across, and the caterpillar can be about 5 inches long. And like other silk moths, the adults do not eat. They have no mouth parts. They don't eat or even nectar, sip water, nothing. They just live to mate, lay eggs, and die. Black walnut is a favorite of several other moths. It also has become a little bit scarce in Texas. It's used for hardwood and furniture, gun stocks, other products. The nuts are great eating by both people and wildlife. And a couple of the moths we associate with this are one, the regal moth, which is a silk moth like the Luna moth. But it looks a little shape-wise, it kind of reminds you more of a hawk moth or a sphinx moth by the wing shape. But the caterpillar for it's called the hickory horned devil. And it is a spectacular, very large caterpillar with some great looking horns. The walnut sphinx is a little less colorful than the regal moth, but the caterpillar for that has some interesting capabilities. It actually will hiss at you if you try picking it up or bothering it by forcing air out of the spiracles along the side of the body there as a defense mechanism. You can probably Google walnut sphinx hissing and you'll find some video on YouTube for that. It's pretty startling. Black cherry, one of our favorite trees in Central Texas, the escarpment black cherry. For us, there are different subspecies in East Texas, Central Texas, and West Texas, but they're all used by several moth species. They have beautiful white flowers in the spring. They turn yellow in the fall, the leaves, and it's just a great tree to have. Small-eyed sphinx larvae will be feeding at night, and they tend to like older leaves on this tree, whereas most times caterpillars, if they're eating leaves, prefer fresh foliage. But small-eyed sphinx is a little bit different that way. The white furcula is a nice-looking little moth, and it's in the prominent family. And I don't know how well you can see it, but this caterpillar photo is showing it doing one of its defensive moves. It's actually the head at the bottom of the picture. And then at the top, it's flailing around these projections that are actually its last two prolegs along the body of the caterpillar. If it's frightened or of something, it forces fluid into its last two prolegs and waves them around like antenna or arms or something in hopes that that'll discourage somebody from eating it. We couldn't skip one of our favorite Transpacus moths. We see this out in Big Bend National Park in late summer, early fall, and it's the largest tiger moth in North America. But the plant it uses is California bricklebush. It'll use that and other Burkhallia species, but California bricklebush is sort of an upright shrub, thickly branched. It's sort of woody, has some non-spectacular little pale yellow-green flowers that never really open up fully, but it is a favorite food of the northern giant flag moth. Northern giant flag moths also exhibit sexual dimorphism. The female has these beautiful orange hind wings, and the male has more white and black. And the caterpillar sort of has the same color scheme, but it's just in the caterpillar form. But only the Burkhallias give the caterpillar the right chemicals to produce good pheromones. It'll eat other things, but it needs really Burkhallia. Now, Lynn had mentioned that we're still learning associations of moths to plants, and this is one that a friend of ours had helped to document and publish just a few years ago. But desert yaupon is sort of a South Texas brush country plant. Another one of these little nondescript, kind of small leaved, gray barked bushes. But it's a kind of a common plant down there. It is a host plant for the Texas wasp moth, which is another tiger moth species, but it's a wasp mimic. And this discovery of this association was only published in 2013, so just 10 years ago. The male Texas wasp moths have these black and orange yellow flange tips on their hind legs that kind of look like cowboy boots, which is kind of fun. And they're kind of sporadic. There were a bunch of them this past fall at the Wildflower Center here in Austin, probably October, November, I can't remember exactly, but they had a good year. Blackbrush acacia is another host plant in Texas, another South Texas brush country plant. It's an early bloomer, legume, kind of another thorny bush, great nectar source for honeybees. And it has some substances that can increase metabolism and decrease appetite, so it could be a weight loss plant. But the black witch moth utilizes this as its host plant, and it's one of the largest moths in North America, 6-inch wingspan. They're big, dark moths. They look like a bat if they're flying around your light at night. And it's got a few cute little associated mythology stories with it. Mariposa de la Muerte, the butterfly of death. One of the little stories is if one flies into your house, somebody's going to die. And the other one that's a little less morbid is if it lands over your front door, that you're going to win the lottery. And we did have, probably 10 years ago, we had one land over our front door, but we never bought a lottery ticket to check out that theory. Should have done it. But they can fly great distances, even all the way up to Canada. Sinizo is another interesting host plant. It's used a lot as a landscaping plant in our area. They're also known as barometer bush. It kind of blooms in response to humidity and rain. There are several lucrophyllum species, but frutescens is the most common one. And it's used by the Coletta silk moth, another big silk moth species. They have a couple broods. The main one is in late fall, and then they also have a smaller brood in the springtime. Now, the males, sometimes the species are kind of diurnal, and the females nocturnal. So I guess they get together at dusk. It'll also eat ocotillo out in West Texas. American beautyberry is a distinct plant for Central and East Texas with these fuchsia berries. It's kind of hard to mistake for anything else. Understory shrub. And it has different chemicals in its leaves that have sort of the same kind of mosquito repelling properties as DEET. So you could just rub some of these on you to keep mosquitoes away. Rustic Sphinx uses this as its host plant. It's another large hawk moth, a little more interestingly marked than some of the others, a little more distinct. And the caterpillar is sort of exhibiting the pose there that gives the Sphinx moth group its name. It's kind of, if they're a little worried or disturbed, they raise up their head and sort of this Sphinx-like pose, kind of like the Egyptian Sphinx. And this little species has these little granules on its tail at the end of the caterpillar. There's some moths that use ferns. So bracken fern is a pretty popular fern in East Texas. Get it over to Bastrop County as well, locally. It's a great little fern, kind of large colonies of it here and there. Spreads or reproduces with microscopic spores that have specific patterns on the underside of the leaves. So it's a little different than other plants that way. But these fern moths that we highlighted, silver spotted fern moth and pink shaded fern moth, they're very specific to ferns, and their caterpillars are very cryptic and hard to find. They blend in very well on the foliage. Cowich vine is another name for sorrel vine. Sorrel vine due to the colors of the stems on this thing. It puts out this fruit in the fall, and a couple moths using it are the Wilson's wood nymph, which is a bird dropping mimic as an adult and has a pretty nice looking caterpillar. You may find them in the fall. And gaudy sphinx is not as common, but it is stunning if you see one. They do come to Central Texas occasionally, but it is a spectacular, fairly large sphinx moth, but it's brilliantly colored and you wouldn't mistake it for anything else. Another one in the grape family, winter grape, is a popular one. A lot of moths like the grapes. It's a woody twining vine with tendrils opposite the leaves. It's distinguished from Mustang grape by having smaller fruits, and the underside of the leaves, instead of being kind of a whitish pubescence like Mustang grape, they're smoother and green. Vine sphinx is one of the sphinx, or one of the moths that use this. The adults begin feeding at dusk. Larvae can be pink, or it can be pale green like we show here, or a lemony green. Some of these caterpillars do have different color morphs. Also, the 8-spotted forester is one of the moths that is a diurnal or a day flyer. And pretty soon we'll be seeing that flying around on coming to redbud and Mexican plum leaves or blooms as they come out this spring. One of the early species usually. Now we mentioned, Lynn had mentioned earlier in the life cycle discussion that some of these moths actually don't make a cocoon, and the vine sphinx is one of those. They'll lay their eggs on the leaves. Caterpillar eats the leaves and goes through its different molts to the last instar, and then it'll go wander off and dig itself a little dirt chamber a few inches below the surface. And it'll overwinter in this little dirt burrow in a pupa form. And then the next year it'll come out, emerge from the ground as an adult. I just love the picture of that one crawling up out of the hole as an adult. That's pretty cool. But then it'll hang out for most of the day to let the wings dry and stiffen up before it takes off. But that's it for the species accounts. And then Lynn, I'll talk a little bit about gardening considerations.
All right, let me try to take it and wrap it up from here. So hopefully you can appreciate some of the plants that moths use. And if you're thinking about doing more for gardening for butterflies or moths, some things to consider, of course. Plant the natives. They are the insect's true hosts, and for you, they require less work once you get them established. Of course, don't use pesticides. Even these mosquito sprays they talk about are equal opportunity killers. Use drip irrigation so you can be water efficient while getting these plants established. And once you do that, you shouldn't need to water them very often. And if you plant them in clusters, this provides what is called flower constancy to insects. And what that means is if you plant, nectar flowers or host plants together, the insect has to work less to actually find the next flower to get nectar from, or the next place to lay eggs. So it is easier for them to be able to reproduce that way and to go through their life cycle. You have to make sure you plant a variety of different types of blooms. And by types, I mean colors, sizes, shapes, sequential bloomers, things that bloom in the spring, throughout the summer, and then the fall. And of course, if you're planting for moths, the night bloomers. As we've said, include both the host and the nectar plants. You can feed all life cycle stages. Plan for density. That'll help suppress the growth of anything you don't want in your yard. And put similar plants together. Consider their needs, like how much water or sun or shade they need, what type of soil, the height, etc. And I think most importantly is embrace imperfection. Doing less benefits wildlife. I'll talk a little bit about that on the next slide. When it comes to maintenance, really you should try to fuss as little as possible. Jim talked about how some of these caterpillars will roll themselves up in a leaf with silk, and that's how they pupate. Or they pupate just an inch or two underground underneath their host plant. Or they actually have a cocoon that either falls into the leaf litter or is hanging low in a shrub or a bush. And so if you constantly rake and blow and cut and prune and dig and work the soil, you're going to damage what you've worked hard to attract, because many of those pupae will overwinter in many of those places. So try to leave it as much as you can. And even the Xerces Society, which is the society promoting the health of pollinators and pollinator gardens, is encouraging people to leave leaves where you can. If you can't leave them on your lawn or don't want to, rake them into a large circular area under trees or in between some shrubs, or use them as mulch in the wintertime. Try not to shred them, because again, you might be actually killing what you worked so hard to attract. And be careful when you do a cutback. That's your time to observe what may be there, what you might want to leave. We never do our cutback until late winter, early spring, usually late February or early March. Because again, seed heads are food for wildlife, and you may be actually cutting down something that's useful to a species during the winter. Of course, there are lots of sources. I won't dwell on this for plants in Texas. We're very fortunate in Austin to have the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center. You can get plant sales and plants and seed exchanges at meetings for the Native Plant Society of Texas, the Master Gardener chapters, Master Naturalists. If you haven't been to Native American Seed or even checked their online catalog, they're a wonderful resource. And then there's other sources around the state. Kerrville has natives of Texas. West Texas has the Chihuahuan Desert Research Institute and Chihuahuan Desert Gardens. And South Texas has the North American Butterfly Association in Mission. So one of the things that is important to provide for moths as well as butterflies is natural moisture, and they get that in the form of nectar, dew. Some of them even use tree sap or even rotting fruit that falls on the ground from fruit trees. But what else you can do is you can supplement that moisture by creating a bait station. And what you do is you create a butterfly bait or a moth bait, making a fermented mixture of bananas, beer, molasses, brown sugar, fruit juice. You can find recipes of this online, but you can just throw it all together in a blender or food processor and kind of mash it up and then pour it into a large glass jar. Don't put a top on it and put it somewhere where it's going to be warm, where other animals can't get at it. Let it ferment for several days. And then it'll create kind of this jelly-like substance that you can pour into a dish and offer. You can paint on a log. One of the great things you can do with kids is create a sugar trail by painting sections of tree trunks at eye level along a trail, and then at night go and see what moths may be attracted to them. Another thing you can do in your own yard is you can blacklight. We do this fairly often, and you create a light trap. You can hang a black light or a mercury vapor light in front of a white sheet. Moths are what's called positively phototactic, which means that they are attracted to different wavelengths of light. And by providing both a black light and a mercury vapor light, you can cover a wide spectrum of lights. And what we do is we turn it on at dusk and leave it on all night, check it periodically, turn it off when it starts to get light out. And we can see what's around. Oftentimes we will collect them, we'll put them in a little container and we'll cool them down so we can photograph them. If you cool them down, they'll be a little less active. Another thing you can do is rear caterpillars, which is a lot of work, especially some of these larger moths where you have to constantly feed them. We kind of short circuit the process and either collect native moth cocoons gathered in the wild, or you can purchase them from places like the Austin Butterfly Forum and other online sources, but you have to be really careful to only get the species that are native to Texas and that their host plants are in the area or even in your yard. So we do that. We usually buy them or find them in the fall. We put them in new Chinese food containers, place them in the crisper drawer of our refrigerator to simulate winter. And then very soon, early March, we actually take them out and put them in leaf litter in the bottom of screened cages on our back porch. And then as the months go on, they emerge and see our cats, Sam and Jesse, helping us there with a Cecropia moth. But once they emerge, we then will cool them down by putting them in a small container in the refrigerator for 20 minutes to a half an hour. And then we take them out and they're quieted down and we can photograph them. Once we do that, we then can release them back into the wild and hope they breed. So here's an example of one of the techniques we use to photograph moths. The picture on the left is a moth that called the Io moth. And this was on our back porch on a stucco wall. And the picture was taken just with a regular 35mm close focusing camera on a single flash. And you can see the wall looks kind of shiny and the colors look a little muddy and there's shadow behind the wings and the antenna. So the way to get around that and get a much more colorful, crisp picture is to use what's called a white box that you see on the upper right of your screen. And this particular white box was put together for us by Dr. John Abbott, a good friend of ours who's now at University of Alabama. And it's got 4 synchronized flashes in it that are synchronized to the shutter on the camera. So you can take them off, place it on the stick inside the box. We use a black velvet for a night simulating background. And then when we press the shutter to take the picture of the moth, all of the flashes go on at once and light the subject very uniformly. So what you see is the picture on the lower right. And I hope you can see that it's a lot better than the one taken on the porch in the middle of the night. And we have to be careful and work pretty quickly because we have about 5 minutes to do this, and then the moths start flying around the room and we have to catch them and let them go.
They don't cooperate for long.
So here's, just to finish up, I'll show you some of the pictures we've taken of moths in the white box. And these are all some of the bigger silk moths for the most part. This is the Cecropia moth, and this gives you a good idea of the size. You can see the inset photograph is the Cecropia moth sitting on my hand. So you can see the size of these moths. And they like Mexican plum. That's one of their favorites. Prometheus silk moth. The Polyphemus moth that Jim talked about earlier with the big eye spots on the hind wings. The regal moth or the royal walnut moth, and this is taken in the white box without the black background. The Coletta silk moth, which Jim said uses Sanitzo. The Forbes silk moth, which is a rare silk moth in South Texas, and those 4 light green windows you see there are actually transparent, translucent windows on the wings. They're very, very beautiful. The Rocky Mountain Agapima, which is a Western Texas species. The imperial moth, which is here in our area. And of course, we'll leave you with just about everybody's favorite, the Luna moth. And this is taken on a piece of bark from a escarpment black cherry tree in our backyard in the white box. So that's it. You have any questions for us?
Yes, there are some questions.
Okay, we're ready.
And that was great. We really enjoyed that. Is there a formal distinction between moths and butterflies?
Formal, no, I don't think. I
They're
don't.
by families. They've, as the taxonomy gets laid out, and there's brushfoots and swallowtails
Well,
and
yeah.
skippers and all that. They're,
How we organize them is formal.
how they're organized is formal. I think, Lynn went through the definition of the differences between butterflies and moths. And I think the families are distinct. We've chosen to call, I guess, it's human cause names these things. And we've chosen to call some of these butterflies and some of these moths. You could call them all elephants if you wanted, I suppose. But,
There's actually a very good book on this subject, just about nature in general. It's called Naming Nature. And it talks about our preponderance to want to move away from how we name things based on how they look or act, and instead name them now on, DNA testing and taxonomy, laboratory work, which isn't necessarily intuitive. So there's both schools of thought. Not a straightforward answer. Sorry about that.
That was a question from Michael, actually, Michael Behrens, whom I'm sure you know.
Who?
Michael Barry, yeah, right. Do any butterflies feed on algae and lichen? You mentioned that that's the moths did.
Yeah,
Butterflies.
there are butterflies.
See,
Butterflies.
I'm not aware of any butterflies that do.
I'm not either, but moths, yes.
The fact that the
The
female
Jalisco.
moth goes down diving to lay eggs in the underwater and algae is kind of amazing to me.
Huh.
There is one, what's the one? Is it the Jalisco?
Petrophila,
Petrophila is a moth here
local.
in Central Texas, local. And that's exactly what happens. The female will actually go underwater for, I don't know, a minute or two and lay eggs in
however long
algae.
it is.
Yeah,
Wow.
it's
Very
pretty impressive.
That's dedication.
The
Yeah.
Jalisco Petrophila moth.
We'll remember that. Okay, so do yellow pitcher plants grow in Austin?
I don't know if you could get one to grow or not. Certainly not natively. They don't. I don't know if you could actually, cultivate them and make them grow or not. They're more of a piney woods kind of soil plant, and like kind of
I think it's
damp
more,
areas too. I don't know if they would
I think it's
like
more
it
of a,
here or not.
right, of a soil problem. to get them to
Yeah.
grow here than anything else, that boggy East Texas
Yeah.
soil. We've never
Mhm.
seen anyone try it here, but maybe you can try to simulate it in a container of some sort.
Yeah.
But the Moth Association is fascinating.
It is. So what resource do you recommend that people use to learn more about the growing conditions for some of the plants that you mentioned?
Yeah, that's one thing that people say about our books. We don't intend our books to be, they're more of a identification. They're not propagation or how to take care of or grow a certain plant. Gosh.
What about the Wildflower Center?
Yeah.
Oh, the Wildflower Center is,
Their website's awesome.
their website's very good. They're actually updating their database, and it's supposed to be, and it's going to be a couple-year project, I think, and it's going to include more care information, not just identification and bloom time, et cetera.
Yeah. That's a great database resource for us. Gosh,
Wasowski's book.
Yeah, I was just trying to think of their names.
If you haven't had this book, then Native Texas Plants by Sally and Andy Wasowski. This is a great book. It not just identifies them, it tells them what plant region that plants grow in and some of their requirements for sun and soil, etc. And of course, Jill Noakes' book, if you want to propagate plants. You familiar with Jill's book? I think there's a new edition out now. It's How to Grow Native Plants of the Southwest. That's also expensive, but very well worth it. Wonderful book.
Great, thank you. So here's another question. Are pentas host plants for moths?
Oh, for the Tursa Sphinx,
Yeah.
it is. Yeah, gorgeous Sphinx moth will eat that. We ended up putting it on the book on a different plant because it was native.
Right.
But
Pentas aren't native.
Penta is not native to Texas, but they will. The caterpillar definitely eats them, and it's a nice looking little Sphinx moth that'll come to your porch light.
It is mostly browns, but it's shaped like a jet fighter. It's a very distinct looking moth.
It's a good looking moth.
Tursa Sphinx, Tersa.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I do have one question that's not up there, and that is, you mentioned the bricklebush in West Texas, and it attracts a certain moth. It's a host plant for a certain moth. Would it be safe to say that the bricklebush that we have here in Austin would also attract not that particular moth, but some kind of moth?
It's
Very
possible.
likely that there is something that eats it. Yeah, moths are, in general, moths are pretty general eaters. A lot of them, and if they'll eat one Brickalia, they're probably going to eat the rest of them too. So I'm pretty confident there's something that eats our local bricklebush. There's so many moth species, and the odds are that just about every plant we have, probably something eats it.
One of our criteria for deciding which moth and host plant associations to put in the book, both for butterflies and for moths, really, was we did a lot of research to determine and have at least 3 or 4 sources where something was confirmed that yes, this species uses that species. We didn't want to just find one instance, because in the past there have been mistakes made.
Yeah.
And that gets propagated through the literature. And so you want to be sure that you at least have 3 to 4 sources of information that seems to make the same sense.
Well,
So we didn't come across anything at this point that's documented for the bricklebush we have here, but as Jim said,
okay.
I'm sure something does eat it.
Huh. Okay. Well, the accolades are just coming in about your presentation. Stunningly beautiful, excellent, very interesting, enjoyable, gorgeous photos. So people are happy with what they learned from you tonight, I think.
Oh, good. We hope so. And
Yeah.
by the way, if anyone wants to contact us, they can do that at naturewatch@austin.rr.com. We do have a blog. We've been trying to keep updated in between trying to clear up between storm damage. And as you mentioned, Jane, we do have another book hopefully coming out later this year. And hopefully it'll be a good one-stop guide for people who want a good introduction to the plants and animals of Central Texas. It'll include common species as well as rare and endemic species.
It'll be just in time for holiday gift.
There we
gift.
go.
There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect stocking stuffer for everyone that lives in Austin.
Yeah.
Well, here's Kaylee to wrap up for us.
Thanks,
Thank
Jane.
you so much,
Thank
Jim and Lynn, for being with us tonight. That was a really great presentation. And I'm so happy that everybody could be here tonight. We had a great turnout, and you should be looking forward to our next presentation, which is actually going to be in person. So our next speaker series is going to be March 16th, and it is going to be at the Travis Audubon Office Building in Hyde Park. So keep an eye out for information about that speaker series presentation in the newsletter in March. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here once again, and have a great evening.
Bye. Have a good night.
Good night.